quiet morning, steady pace, nothing dramatic yet, which fits this chapter better than most, because it's less about a single hard moment and more about a slow, easy-to-miss trap that shows up specifically after real progress has already happened. The chapter is called Uncommon Amongst Uncommon, and it picks up at a point in the story where a lot of people would reasonably stop pushing. By this point, the achievements already covered, the trident, the extreme weight loss, entering ultra-endurance racing with no background at all, had already placed this particular story well outside anything resembling ordinary. Most people, having gotten that far, would have a good case for calling it enough. This chapter argues against exactly that instinct. Not because rest is bad, but because there's a specific trap hiding inside the comfort of having already become unusual. I want to spend this whole episode on that trap because I think it's the first idea in this book that applies more to later stages of a project than to the beginning. In this channel, 21 episodes and 2 books deep now, is arguably close enough to that later stage to actually need it. It's worth naming why this chapter waited until now to arrive, both in the book and in this series. Everything covered so far has been about building something from nothing. Honest accounting, tested beliefs, structured suffering, trained self-talk, the unglamorous work substituting for talent. All of that assumes a person's still climbing. This chapter is the first one addressed specifically to someone who's actually gotten somewhere, which is a genuinely different problem than the ones the earlier chapters were solving. It's a strange kind of problem to have, worth acknowledging honestly rather than rushing past. Most of the difficulties covered across the last 20 episodes have been the kind that announce themselves clearly. An injury, a plateau, a missed goal, something obviously wrong demanding attention. This one doesn't announce itself at all. It shows up disguised as comfort, as satisfaction, as the entirely reasonable feeling of having actually earned a rest after real, sustained effort. That disguise is exactly what makes it worth a full episode rather than a passing mention. Because a trap that feels like success is considerably harder to notice than one that feels like failure. Here's the core idea worth sitting with directly. Once a person has become genuinely uncommon relative to an average baseline, showing up consistently when most people don't, tracking honestly when most people guess, respecting real signals when most people either ignore or catastrophize them, there's a real temptation to let that comparison become the permanent measuring stick. Compared to average, uncommon already looks impressive, and it's easy to let that comparison quietly become the finish line rather than a milestone passed along. The way. This chapter's argument is that real growth requires deliberately raising the reference group again, from average people to other uncommon people, and then asking honestly whether there's still room to stand out even inside that harder, smaller comparison. There's a reason this comparison is so comfortable to settle into, worth naming plainly. Comparing against average is genuinely satisfying, because the gap is large and the evidence of having closed it is everywhere, visible in nearly every ordinary interaction with people who haven't built the same consistency. That satisfaction is real and earned. It's also, this chapter argues, a kind of plateau disguised as a finish line, comfortable precisely because it's easy to keep winning once it's already been won, which is exactly the condition under which most genuine growth quietly stops without anyone consciously deciding to stop it. I want to bring this into something personal because I think this channel is sitting close to exactly the point this chapter is describing. Compared to where this project started, a body with old injuries and years of stopped and started attempts, what's actually been built over these last 21 episodes is genuinely uncommon relative to that original baseline. Daily consistency, honest tracking, a body that's been rebuilt through deliberate, unglamorous work rather than talent. Measured against where this all started, that's a real, legitimate transformation, and it would be reasonable at this point to treat that as the actual finish line. I noticed this trap directly a few weeks ago, catching myself measuring a given week's effort against a version of this project from a year ago, which is an easy comparison to win by now, rather than against what a genuinely committed, experienced runner at this same stage would actually be doing. The comparison against year one me had become almost meaningless as a growth signal. Not because that early version wasn't a real, honest starting point, but because nearly any consistent effort now, even a mediocre one by current standards, would look impressive against that specific baseline. The comparison had quietly stopped measuring anything useful, even though it still felt satisfying every time it got checked. This chapter's whole argument is that treating it as the finish line would be a mistake, not because the progress isn't real, but because uncommon compared to where I started is still a fairly low bar once it's actually been cleared. The next honest comparison isn't the old, sedentary starting point anymore. It's other people who've also built real consistency, real discipline, and asking honestly whether there's still room to stand out even against that harder group. Asterisk, asterisk. There's a specific distinction worth drawing here, because this idea can easily get confused with something covered several episodes back in the previous book, treating doubt and past failure as structured fuel for a hard mile. That earlier tool was about a single difficult moment, a specific mile, a specific comparison used once and set back down. This chapter is describing something slower and more structural, a standing, ongoing habit of periodically raising the actual reference group being measured against, rather than a tool reached for on one particularly hard morning. The earlier tool was a scoreboard for a mile. This one is closer to periodically checking whether the entire scoreboard itself has become too easy to win. It's worth being precise about the timescale difference too, since that's really what separates the two ideas mechanically. The mile scoreboard tool gets picked up and set down within a single run, sometimes within a single hard stretch of one. This chapter's comparison raising happens on a timescale closer to months, checked periodically rather than moment to moment, and it's meant to shape the general direction of a whole training period rather than get a person through one specific difficult mile. Confusing the two, trying to apply this chapter's slow, structural comparison every single morning the way the mile scoreboard tool gets applied on hard days, would produce exactly the kind of exhausting, constant dissatisfaction the boundary in this episode is warning against. I want to walk through what raising that reference group actually looks like in practice, because the idea alone risks staying abstract. It doesn't mean comparing against an elite professional runner immediately, which would just recreate the same discouraging, unproductive comparison this channel has warned against since a few episodes into the first book. It means finding the next tier up, specifically, honestly, close enough to be a genuine stretch rather than either an easy win or an impossible reach. For this channel, that's meant looking specifically at other runners who came to the sport later in life, with real physical limitations, and who've built genuinely serious training consistency despite that, rather than comparing against either the general population or elite athletes with entirely different starting conditions. I want to be specific about how that next tier actually got identified, because find someone slightly ahead of you can stay vague without a concrete method attached. The search wasn't for the single most impressive example available, which would have recreated the discouraging comparison this whole idea is trying to avoid. It was for people whose starting conditions matched closely enough that the comparison actually felt like useful information rather than an unfair contest. Similar age, similar history of injury, a similar late start relative to lifelong athletes. That specificity is what makes the comparison actually motivating rather than simply discouraging in a new, more sophisticated disguise. I found it useful to actually write down what made a given comparison feel motivating versus discouraging once I had a few candidates to consider. A comparison that produced a specific actionable thought, something like that specific training habit is probably the gap, felt genuinely useful. A comparison that produced only a vague, diffuse sense of falling short, with no specific actionable difference identifiable, wasn't actually doing the job this chapter describes, regardless of how impressive the person being compared against happened to be. The useful version of this practice always points towards something concrete and doable. The useless version just produces a feeling. There's a boundary worth being precise about here, because this idea can tip into something genuinely unhealthy if it's applied without real care. And it's worth naming that risk directly, given how this whole book leans toward relentless self-comparison already. Continuously raising the reference group is not the same as permanent dissatisfaction, an inability to ever acknowledge real progress, or a standard that keeps moving specifically to ensure nothing ever feels like enough. The distinction that actually matters is whether raising the bar happens periodically and deliberately, with real acknowledgement of the progress that justified raising it in the first place, or whether it happens constantly and reflexively, denying any sense of accomplishment the moment it starts to form. The first is genuine growth. The second is a specific, exhausting trap that borrows this chapter's language while doing something considerably less healthy underneath it. This distinction matters enough to dwell on for a moment, because the book itself, read without this specific caution attached, could reasonably be misread as an argument for permanent, relentless dissatisfaction, always finding the next uncommon group to feel inadequate against. That's not actually what this chapter is arguing, even if the intensity of the surrounding book makes that misreading tempting. A healthy relationship with this idea includes real stopping points, real moments where the current level of achievement gets to simply be enjoyed and acknowledged before any new comparison gets introduced. Skipping that acknowledgement entirely, treating every achievement as merely a launching pad for the next one with no pause in between, isn't the disciplined version of this idea. It's a version that eventually burns out the exact motivation it's trying to sustain. I want to be direct about how to tell the difference, because it matters enough to state plainly. A healthy version of this practice pauses to genuinely acknowledge real progress before raising the comparison, treating the new, harder reference group as the next chapter rather than proof the previous one didn't count. An unhealthy version skips the acknowledgement entirely, using the new comparison to immediately erase whatever was just accomplished. The test is simple. Did the achievement get a real moment of acknowledgement before the bar moved? Or did the bar move so fast the achievement never actually got a land at all? So here's what this looks like as a practice, kept to one thing rather than scattered across several. The way this channel has approached every idea across both books so far. Once every few months, not more often than that. Take honest stock of whatever comparison has been the default lately. If it's still measuring against where this specific project started, check whether that comparison has become too easy to win reliably. If it has, deliberately identify the next tier up, specific and close enough to be a genuine stretch, and let that become the new working comparison for a while, with real acknowledgement of the progress that earned the promotion to a harder reference group in the first place. I want to add one specific step to that practice that's made it considerably easier to hold the boundary between healthy and unhealthy versions of this idea. Before naming the new, harder comparison, write down explicitly what actually justified raising it, the specific progress, the specific consistency, the specific evidence that the old comparison had genuinely become too easy. That written acknowledgement, done deliberately before moving to the next tier, is what keeps this practice from sliding into the constant, unearned dissatisfaction the boundary in this episode warns against. Skipping straight to the new comparison without that step is exactly how this idea turns unhealthy without anyone quite noticing the shift happening. There's a second habit worth pairing with the periodic review, useful for the months in between rather than just the review itself. If a specific week's effort starts to feel automatically impressive purely because it's being measured against a starting point from a year or more ago, that's worth treating as a small, early signal rather than waiting for the full quarterly review to notice the pattern. Not every signal like that needs an immediate response, but noticing it consistently across several weeks, is usually the clearest early indication that the working comparison has quietly become too easy again, well before the scheduled review would have caught it on its own. I want to add one final practical note about timing, because getting this wrong in either direction undermines the whole practice. Checking too frequently, weekly instead of quarterly, turns this into exactly the kind of constant, exhausting comparison the boundary in this episode warns against, never letting any single stretch of progress settle before questioning whether it's still impressive enough. Checking too rarely, once a year or less, risks staying inside an outgrown comparison for months longer than necessary, quietly coasting on a bar that's already been cleared without anyone noticing it needed raising. Somewhere in the range of every few months seems to hit the right balance. Frequent enough to catch the drift, infrequent enough to let real acknowledgement actually happen in between. Tomorrow morning, whatever comparison has been running quietly in the background is worth checking honestly. If it's still comparing against a starting point genuinely uncommon as already outgrown, this chapter's whole argument is that there's more room available. Not because nothing accomplished so far actually mattered, but because uncommon, once it's actually been reached, was never meant to be where the growing stopped. I want to close with something specific about where this leaves the channel itself. 21 episodes into a project that started with a single decision in the dark before an alarm finished ringing. That comparison, year one me against today, still means something real, still deserves the acknowledgement this whole episode has argued for. But it's also, honestly, exactly the comparison this chapter is warning against leaning on indefinitely. The next honest measuring stick isn't a version of this project from a year ago anymore. It's other people, further along or differently along the same kind of path, close enough to be genuinely instructive rather than either comfortably easy or discouragingly distant. I think that's the real reason this chapter earned its place in this particular book, and maybe the real reason it felt worth a full episode here too. Every idea covered across both books so far has assumed a person still needing to prove something to themselves, still building the basic case that real change was possible at all. This chapter is for whatever comes after that case has already been made, once, honestly, and the only remaining question is whether the growing continues anyway, for its own sake, once the original doubt has already been answered. That's a genuinely different motivation than the one this whole series started with. And it feels worth naming plainly, 21 episodes in, that the reason for continuing has actually shifted along the way. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, measured against whichever comparison actually still has something left to teach. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.